March 1863. Buds of yellow crocus push through a light dusting of snow. Twigs on the maples twitch, anticipating spring. The town of Amherst, Massachusetts whispers about the daughter of Edwin Dickinson, one of the most prominent men in town. She's odd, townspeople were heard to say. They say she never goes out of the house. Followed by, and there's something weird going on between her and her brother's wife. Emily stares at the house next door, the Evergreens, home of Austin and his wife Susan. She tucks an errant stream of hair into her tight bun, adjusts the collar of her white dress, sighs. Is she there? There's a knock on her bedroom door. Emily? Yes, Father. She pushes her desk chair back, stands and walks toward the door. As she opens it, a newspaper enters the room, followed by her father. Thought you might want to hear about what your friend Tom is doing in Florida. Made the New York Times. He hands her the folded paper. She takes it and pulls back close to her eyes. Jacksonville. She points her face to her father. Thomas Wentworth Higginson has captured Jacksonville. Everett Dickinson lets out a light chuckle. And he did it with the squadron of black troops, former slaves from South Carolina. He lays the paper down in Emily's writing desk. You'll get a kick about the way he describes the conquest. Thank goodness nobody put up much of a fight. Emily clutches the paper to her breast, turns and looks out the window. Maybe this horror will be over soon. I don't see how we can keep going. The soldiers, sighs and turns back at her father. I can't imagine Tom in this struggle. He's so eloquent and tender, but he does believe in the cause. You know how he despises the idea of slavery. We owe them more than we can ever repay. Turned and put his hand on the door. Do read the article. Your friend is a hero. I'll read it, Father. She touches her father's shoulder as he opens the door. By the way, have you seen Susan today? No, Emily, I haven't. But if I do, I'll tell her you ask about her. At the window, her fingers trace a memory of last summer's clouds on the glass. She sits at her desk, clutches a pencil. Her head darts back and forth until she spots an old envelope. She opens the envelope, unfolds the corners. They look like wings, hummingbirds. She remembers the birds darting from flower to flower, presses the envelope flat. With her palm, she writes, a root of evanescence with a revolving wheel, a resonance of emerald, a crush of cochineal, and every blossom on the bush adjusts its tumbled head, the mail from Tunis probably, an easy morning's ride. 1863, Henry Ward Beecher visits his sister Harriet. Harriet sits on a red velvet sofa in her parlor. The furniture is Victorian style, as is she. Henry is dashing, not handsome, but powerful. His presence enters the room ahead of his body. His flesh floats in upon the wake. Dear sister, Henry bows and kisses Harriet on the cheek. It's been too long. This terrible war limits our lives so much. Yes, brother, I've missed you and our conversations. Harriet adjusts herself on the sofa. Please sit. She motions to a nearby chair. How have you been? I'm well. Much better now that Mr. Lincoln has proclaimed that slavery is over in the United States of America. Perhaps now we can get through this war and move along as a country. Henry, we have fought so long for this, you especially. We should congratulate ourselves, albeit cautiously. I agree, dear sister, and you will go down in history as the one who informed the country of the horrors of slavery. I did little more than preach. People like you and Tom Higginson are the ones who did the hard work. Oh yes, dear Tom, they say he worked with John Brown. Did you see that he led a battalion of former slaves to capture Jacksonville, Florida? Harriet smiles. The account of the capture is entertaining, to say the least. Henry takes a book he has clutched under his arm and slides it to Harriet. Have you heard of this? She touches the cover. The Origin of Species, On the Origin of Species, and looks at her brother. Charles Darwin. Have you heard of it? Yes, I've heard of it, but I thought it was a bit scientific for me. Have you read it? Henry smacks his lips, devoured it, read many passages a dozen times. Oh, my dear brother, what interests you so? It changes everything. I'm a minister, committed to preaching the Word of God. I read the scriptures daily, meditate on them. The Bible is my anchor. The words are constant and true. Now this fellow comes along and causes me to question everything, the Word of God and my faith. Harriet lays the book by her side, leans forward and puts her hand on her brother's. There, dear brother, your faith is fine. Yes, I read the Bible too daily and find it hopeful and comforting. But you know, there are those who can take the same words and twist and turn them to their own devices. I can think of many a politician who held the Bible up, shaking it, quoting this scripture or that to condone slavery, abuse of women, and the subjugation of anything and everything just so that they would see fit. I think it's meant to be challenged. Harriet, this Darwin chap makes sense. It's scientific research. He suggests that human beings, our species, instead of being put here on this land as images of God by the actual breath of God to rule over all things natural, he suggests that we are just another animal, one that, through a mistake of nature, developed the ability to dominate the earth. That God has nothing to do with it. Henry, I'm sure you can find room in your heart for both ideas. Your sermons are magical. You've inspired so many people. Focus on your gospel of love. The other will work itself out in a few years. I suppose you're right. Meanwhile, I'll think about inspiration. By the way, I'm buying another painting from our friend Martin Johnson Heade. He's headed to Brazil in a few months to paint hummingbirds. Fancy that, hummingbirds. Harriet stands and walks to the window. She looks to the bare twigs of winter. Hummingbirds. 1863. The United States is ripped apart by a bloody and cruel war. A group of radical thinkers inspired the system of slavery to be challenged. Lincoln has proclaimed the slaves are free. The fate of the country hangs in the battlefields. Prior to the middle of the 19th century, all of the Western world was informed by a consistent cosmology. This cosmology was the distillation of a multitude of creation stories and philosophies that had come down through the Middle East and the Mediterranean area in various iterations. The end result was codified during the first few centuries of the Christian church and is considered to be the absolute truth, words sent down by God. It informed the masses that an all-knowing God on a particular week, about 7,000 years prior, created the heavens and the earth. He fashioned man, Adam, made from clay, then woman, Eve, from Adam's rib. God gave Adam dominion over all plants and animals, and the creatures of the sea, the birds of the air, mammals, reptiles that wander the land. He was also given dominion over the earth itself, to use and do with as he pleased. No questions asked, man was in charge. During the 15th century, the average human became literate. The importance of man as a guiding force in the earth became more significant. Humanism evolved as a reigning philosophy, with the intellect of man being the last word in the context of workings of the world. Inspired by the divine, of course. Darwin's publication on the origin of species in 1859 shook the theological foundations of the Western world. The implications of man's evolution from a lower order primate flew in the face of religious conservatism. Not only did it show the progress of natural selection, it suggested that apes were close cousins of humans. How could this be so? What are the implications? Several years ago, while in the midst of a research in conjunction with an exhibition of work mounted at the Catenary Museum, many of you might have seen Feast of Flowers. I also did a digital publication that required a lot of research and thought. I stumbled upon a term that piqued my interest. It was called radical naturalism. I'm not sure exactly where I ran into the term, and I wasn't sure what it meant, but the putting the words radical and naturalism together really excited me. We know that the history of art is full of isms, from classicism to romanticism, beyond to realism, surrealism, impressionism, fauvism, cubism, abstract expressionism, on and on and on. I've always been curious about the concept of naturalism, especially when it investigates as it relates to realism. We know when we portray images of the natural world, they must have a degree of accuracy and realism in order to communicate the abstract ideas concerning the nature of the intended subject. We also know that often artists sacrifice a perfect visual realism of a natural object or scene in order to tell a story about a particular happening within the natural order. In 1863, Martin Johnson Heade goes to Brazil in order to paint hummingbirds. He leaves his friends and fellow abolitionists behind in the midst of a brutal combat, fighting a cause they all held dear. Perhaps in light of this radical way of looking at the natural world, we look at hummingbirds paintings of Martin Johnson Heade with a new attitude. Naturalism, as practiced by Heade and his mid-19th century comrades, was concerned with making paintings that were beautiful natural settings. Maybe the shift with Heade was that he created a unique special relationship within the confines of the rectilinear surface of the painting. The images are a bit unsettling because the viewer is suspended in a definite location, but the hummingbird is not part of the landscape, but in effect what the painting is about. The land itself is a stage set in order for Heade to talk about the hummingbirds. It's a study of a genus, a type of bird that is portrayed in critical detail. The difference is that the paintings are about hummingbirds instead of being of hummingbirds. The paintings are not so much inspired by nature, but are in effect informed by nature. The word of is replaced with about. Inspiration is replaced by information. There is no doubt that Heade set out to create a beautiful series of paintings. No doubt that the thought of economic possibilities of the prints made sense to him. But the subjects, the hummingbirds, and their transitory nature of their images took charge of the project. Evanescence. Radical naturalism continued to snake around in my head. I knew well what the implications of the word naturalism within the context of art meant, that images could portray ideas as they actually appeared instead of idealized versions. Being a child of the 60s, I also had a pretty good understanding of the term radical. An image of Angela Davis comes to mind, fist held high with that determined look on her face. Hell-bent on making a difference. No chance of accepting status quo. How can the nature of art allow nature to dominate the product in a more radical form? How can nature be reconstructed as a work of art so that it transcends the image itself and becomes, in effect, a path to a greater understanding of the natural world? Transcendence. An experience that celebrates the natural world in a new way, not just as an observer, but perhaps as a participant. All nature is held up. Man is just another part of the puzzle. The first artist I'll discuss, we will consider a 21st century artist, not because he was of the 21st century, he wasn't even of the 20th century, but his most significant creation is scheduled for completion in 2026, 100 years after he died. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to spend some time in the beautiful Catalan city, Barcelona. I've always been interested in the great Catalan architect, Antoni Gaudí, but I thought his creations were simply whimsical and fantastic. I knew that he exhibited some innovative engineering in order to achieve his vision, but I had no real understanding of Gaudí's mind and what he was attempting to do. Standing in front of Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, I started to get more insight into Gaudi's attitude toward the natural world and thought to myself, this must be radical naturalism. I spend a lot of time in the woods, always have. In the woods, things feel right. I never know exactly how to translate the difference of a feeling of naturally defined space and a space that is engineered by humans. The way branches intersect in order to support the forest canopy creates a space that the great medieval cathedrals attempted to emulate but never quite did. The mathematics, engineering, and the implementation seem to consistently have the stamp of the human in tow. Sagrada Familia is different. In 1883, when Gaudí took charge of the temple, there was a marked change. Something was happening that had never been attempted before in architecture. Gaudí observed this way a spider's line of filament draped from branch to branch, the way vines snake from one to another. He plotted the curves and applied them to his architectural formulae. The Catenary Arch was developed by direct observation of nature. Gaudí mimicked the natural curve by using chains and string, then inverting the arches to use in his architecture. The result was an arch that broke free of the buttresses, an arch that was not only inspired by nature, but was directly informed by the workings of the natural world. The space created in the Sagrada Familia, along with the various other Gaudí structures in Barcelona, struck a nerve with me. They seem truly natural in a more radical way. Beyond the ribs of the catenary arches that hold the cathedral aloft, Gaudí designed everything, the decoration, the light, even the sound. The experience is organic, spiritual for sure, natural, but in a radical way. Standing in the center of the Sagrada Familia in the late afternoon sun is captured by the red glass, the windows, then reflected back and forth on itself. It's much the same as Emily Dickinson describes the air where the hummingbird was, a rush of cochineal. I doubt that Antoni Gaudí had ever heard of the little-known American poet Emily Dickinson. Dickinson was living a total recluse by the time Gaudí came of age. There's no real connection. But there is an invisible connection that floats on clouds of air that joins these two artists, the idea they want to say something differently. Gaudí communicated the natural space and light and sound. Dickinson with words. We think back to Emily Dickinson's poem about the root of evanescence. We watch the hummingbirds at the feeder. They hover and dart. Now you see them, now you don't. We often find ourselves just remembering them and by their absence. A resonance of emerald, a rush of cochineal. Emily Dickinson chose a radical form in order to describe the memory of hummingbirds. Martin Johnson Heade's form was more traditional, but it certainly sends radical implications for us in the 21st century. He communicated the way these seldom seen South American hummingbirds and orchids informed their space. 2020, whoa, 2020. Darwin tells us that we are no longer tied to an archaic cosmology. Dickinson lets us explore new forms of communicating the image and the void that the birds leave behind. As I spent time researching the internet, preparing for this lecture, my research led me to several contemporary artists doing great work, speaking boldly, eloquently on environmental issues, making statements about climate change. I suggest you do the same. There's one artist I've been following for several years I'd like to mention. You might find further research interesting. I cover him here because his use of materials is significant. He explains the natural world using materials of the natural world. Herman Devries was born in 1931. He's a Dutch artist, and he's been making work about nature and plants since 1953. One of his significant pieces is about Saint Boniface. It's Donner's oak, which is a tree sacred to the Germanic pagans. Saint Boniface cut the tree down and used the wood to build a church. Devries planted a 7-meter oak in a 2002 installation surrounded by gold-tipped spears. There is an inscription which states in Latin, "Winfried cut me down, Herman resurrected me." His art includes various other vegetative installations, along with pressed or preserved organic matter and soil rubbings. If you catch him online, you'll find various video images and installations. I suggest strongly you look him up. He's one of the more interesting of the environmental artists. I wanted, when preparing this talk, I didn't want to get bogged down in contemporary environmental art. There's so much out there that I think you'd be better off spending time yourself just doing a Google search of contemporary environmental artists, because there's tons of stuff out there. There are hundreds of other artists who, instead of bringing these artists to you, I decided the bit of time we have together would be best spent talking about the concept of using radical forms to explain the natural world and our place in it. A recent article in Audubon magazine fell into my eyes while preparing for this talk. The title struck me, "Jewels of the Sky." How many gemstone references do we see in the titles of Heade's paintings? Topaz, ruby, amethyst, emerald. The great naturalist John James Audubon described the Rufus Hummingbird in the following way: like a breathing gem or a magic carbuncle of glowing fire, stretching out its gorgeous ruff as to emulate the sun itself in splendor. This article was written by Benji Jones and photographs by Sean Greiser. Mr. Jones describes the patch of ruffled feathers at the neck of hummingbirds called the gorget. The thing that makes these ruffled feathers so remarkable is that they are actually not colored. They're not colored in the same way we think of pigments working. He goes on to explain that these colors that we see on the throats of so many hummingbirds are not strictly pigments like we define in a tomato or an orange, but they are in effect attributed to tiny structures in feathers made up of microscopic bubbles of air that influence the reflection of light. Looking closely at these, we see what looks like mountainous ridge. Here quotes Sean Greiser, the photographer. It's the light moving and bending over these ridges that creates coloration. Here I'll quote directly from the article. While pigments determine which wavelengths of light are absorbed or reflected back by a material, microstructures in gorget feathers affect how these reflected waves interact with each other before reaching the observer. It's those reinforced waves that create the intense color we see. Because the color is created through reflection, it varies by the observer's position. The article goes on to talk about the proposed reason that this coloration evolved on those particular species. So fascinating as this bit of science is, what does it have to do with art? And what does it have to do with naturalism? Moreover, what does it have to tie in with the term radical naturalism? I think about 1863. Heade sets out to Brazil to paint the hummingbirds. I know as a painter the challenges he faced. He put the brush to canvas. Pigments alone wouldn't allow him to capture the essence of these flying jewels. The resonance of emerald, how does one capture evanescence on the canvas? The color that you thought you saw. With new technology, perhaps put together in new ways and new spaces, can you imagine how today's Emily Dickinson would describe that place in the air that once held a hummingbird? Evanescence? Could a modern day naturalist be able to capture the color of a gorget on the throat of a hummingbird? Maybe an art installation with lights and lasers and computer animation. Here we are in the 21st century. A new artist wants to communicate to the general public what he sees. I can speak to my own practice and the ideas of radical naturalism. We all know what naturalism looks like in drawing and painting. I've been fortunate in my career to have had the time to explore a lot of places and make a lot of paintings. I paint trees and flowers and natural scenes, of course, But my intent is to go beyond just putting a recognizable image of a tree and flower in a place. I have a rule. Any tree or flower, insect, bird, place I want to paint, I must have experienced it. That is not to say necessarily I paint on sight. More often than not, I am knee-deep in the subject and have to rely on my meager photographic skills. I shoot a quick selfie very often with a particular subject or in a certain place to prove to myself that I was there, and also to use it as evidence for the future. I'm very interested in wild places. I've spent a lot of time in my life to inform people about the values of the wild. When I go into natural settings and find that natural order left to its own devices, both a visual and physical space that is more aesthetically pleasing than the vast majority of human-generated spaces, I find myself a bit awestruck. I go to a state forest on the west side of Jacksonville, Cary State Forest. The foresters there have an intent on allowing the longleaf pine saw palmetto to develop the way they did hundreds of years before the European interaction with Florida Peninsula. They practice controlled burning, which mimics a natural system before communities and highways interrupted the vast expanse of pine forest. A power line bisects the property. A barrel pit parallels the power line. Vegetation is kept low under these power lines. What we see along this feature, I call it the ditch, is a magical succession of native perennials. That's referred to as secondary succession, and it's plants that come in and occupy, or seeds are found in the seed bed and they occupy disturbed soil. Various carnivorous species, sundew, hooded pitcher plant, butterwort, various native terrestrial orchids such as the snowy orchid, grass pinks, and rosebud orchids occupy the space. Dozens of other species live in that place I call the ditch. I've never been as disappointed when I go there. Something is always blooming. Now I'll show you a few images of me and the natural place of the flower I'm trying to collect. So the selfie I use, a lot of these are time date stamped also, and also a GPS coordinate, so I can use it as a reference to know what time of year, where I was, and I can refer others with exact GPS coordinates to a place. This is on the top of the Blue Ridge Parkway. This is the purple fringed orchid. Here I am in a tangle of muscadine vines, which is one of my favorite things. I like to look up into the trees and see these vines that seem to go on forever, and they also seem ageless. Here I am with Lilium catesbii, the Catesby's lily, which is one of my favorite things. I also often I'll capture my shadow with a particular plant or in a particular place. So it also, I think that my shadow in a way is kind of a personal evanescence. It's something that was there that's no longer there. So I've cast a shadow on the place. This was a recent trip. This is down in Ocala National Forest, and Betsy Harris, who's a friend, and I've been enjoying following her experiences in the Cary State Forest. She posted some images of grass of Parnassus, which is a plant that I've really never seen in the wild. I was familiar with it, but she captured some images of it blooming in a particular place in the juniper wilderness in Ocala National Forest. So I went down and paddled, actually on this instance, I jumped in the creek and walked up the sandy creek in the muck and found the last bloom of the ones that she had described. She gave me excellent directions, by the way, and so I was able to capture the plant in a photograph. I left it undisturbed, and I captured myself capturing the plant. So it was part of my practice and trying to understand and portray the natural world. This was a recent trip to Palestine Lake over near Olustee. And this is another example of me paddling in Blackwater. I went there with my friend Michael Fitzsimmons, and we paddled out Luckily, he has the patience to go get me into these places. We paddled out into this blackwater natural pond, and this is the lilies are the yellow spatterdock, and the Helianthus angustifolius, the native fall sunflower, is blooming and reflected in the water. So, and that's me proving to myself and the world that I was there then, and that's what I was interested in being. Here I am at Hawksbill and the mountains, the Blue Ridge Parkway, and that is a clump of the native vegetation at the summit of Hawksbill. This is in the ditch. This is the Bartram's rose gentian, which is a favorite flower of mine. And that I'd never seen it before until I found it in this disturbed, really what appeared to be a drainage ditch under a power line. But I found, and a lot of us do, we find this incredible species that volunteer there, and they just come up because the birds have toes or snouts of wild pigs or some reason. These plants all seem to be planted there as if they wanted to have a place to be. This is an image of me spotting columbine growing, the native columbine growing in the wild, which is always a treat to see. It's not easy to find, but it's one of my very favorite plants. This is a painting I did several years ago. This is the center panel is 6 feet tall by 9 feet wide, and the two outer panels are 6 feet tall by 3 feet wide. This is a triptych about the ditch. The panel on the left will be shown in the Cumber Museum beginning in January with an exhibition that Holly Harris is curating. It's of the Yopon holly, which is on the banks of the ditch. The center panel is actually about this little, that if you see in the middle, there's this interrupted water. It looks like it's kind of a milky substance. That's a plant, an underwater carnivorous plant called Bladderwort. This plant has little little suction bladders, and it eats larvae out of the water. So then above it is the water lilies, the native water lily that's blooming, and then the reflection is a longleaf pine. So you've got several different layers of meaning in this plant. You've got the obvious water, you've got the reflection of another world which exists in the canopy of the longleaf pine forest, and then you've got the this drama that's going on with the bladderwort, and it's a drama that you have to be informed from a different source because you can't see it, and it's only the hint of what you're seeing in the middle of it. The far right panel, those of you who spend any time in the woods are familiar with the Pygmy Rattler. These are diminutive rattlesnakes. They're less than 2 feet long, and they pack as much of a wallop in their venom as a full timber rattler. So they're I've always loved seeing any kind of snake because there's so few of them that we have left. But these are a little bit scary if you step on them. So. This is a recent painting that I've done of the water lilies in the ditch, and I'm taking that idea of the water lily and trying to spend a little bit more time explaining that system with the, where you've got the surface, you've got the surface of the water, what's going on under the water, the tension of the water lily and the water itself, and the reflection of the pine trees in it. So it's one of my favorite things to look at and study and try to figure out how can I say this in a way that is meaningful and it makes sense. This last scene is I'd shown you several images of Heade's paintings with hummingbirds, and not as many of the orchids, but he's extremely famous of painting the South American orchids. This little fella is a rosebud orchid, which comes up all on its own on the, it's only about I think at the most 4 inches above the soil. This little orchid comes up and blooms on the banks of the ditch, and it's one of my favorite things. When I first discovered it, was informed of it by um, um, the naturalist at Cary State Forest. I was really amazed at this thing that, in our mind, we look at some ditch with black water in it. We think, oh, this is just muck. You can see the toe prints of wild pigs where the pigs have been rooting in it. And you think, well, what could possibly be? And this thing is just an ugly ditch. But you start looking at it and you develop a radical form of looking at that world, not thinking in terms of what other people think, but thinking in, let's look and see what's there. And also through information. You start informing your eyes, you inform yourself, and at some point, I think you inform your soul about the magic of these natural spaces. I want to thank the Cumber Museum. Thanks to Emily Moody for helping me kind of work through this. This is a very it's a new world, and I think we've been dealt a wallop of nature this year with the pandemic. But I'll tell you, it's given me a lot of time to read. I've probably gone through since the pandemic at least 50 books. One of those I've put in here an image of the catalog for the cross-pollination show at the museum, which if you haven't seen the exhibition yet, I strongly urge you to see it. It's absolutely gorgeous. It strikes my heart because I've always wanted to see the Heade hummingbird paintings together like that, and they were just absolutely spectacular. The one thing that really piqued my interest about the whole thing was that the book, A Summer of Hummingbirds by Christopher Benfey. I really recommend this book. It is a delight, and the little bit of creative nonfiction I opened the lecture with was based on what I learned from this book about Jacksonville and its relationship to. I knew that there was a relationship with Martin Johnson Heade, that he lived in St. Augustine the latter part of his life, and I knew that Harriet Beecher Stowe lived in Jacksonville. I never really got the full implications of that I guess you call it that tribe of abolitionists who were really responsible for the Civil War and the effects of the Civil War. So I never really got the full implications of all these people, and I never would have known about Thomas Wentworth Higginson and his relationship to Emily Dickinson, and how that had such a profound effect on Jacksonville, Florida. So I think it's radical in a way to learn about where you are and what you do. It's radical to walk out into the woods. It's radical to pick up a book and read it. It's radical to go to an exhibition at a museum. I think it's a kind of a radical world that I want to be a part of. So thank you to the Cumber. Thank you for being here. Now Emily is showing me a screen with several questions. What are the pink flowers in the ditch? I'm not sure what that's your part. The pink flowers, and I would make a stab at the Linnaean classification, which I tried to do. And when I write, I use it all the time. But the common name is Bartram's rose gentian. William Bartram has a significant relationship to Jacksonville, and that's one of the many plants he named on his travels. If you haven't read the Travels of William Bartram, from the 18th century naturalist who came through this part of the world and around the time of the Revolutionary War. Do you have a home garden? Not really. Ownership of plants, I've struggled. I used to be a big gardener. I struggled with, and I was interested in native plants. And years ago in Beaufort, South Carolina, I actually was part owner of a native plant nursery. And when you get into that world of native plants, you get into this idea of possession and this idea of collection. And all my tribe at the time was, do you have this? Do you have that? I've got this, I've got that. And I think that recently, in my idea about gardening, is taking a step back. And yes, I have a garden. I mean, I can walk down a sidewalk and I can see all these plants pushing up in the cracks of pavement, and that's a garden. I, I like the idea of gardening, and I like the idea of making things beautiful, but I like more the idea of understanding how the wild is beautiful in its own right. Uh, what's your most inspiring spot you visited this year? I go all over. I mean, there's so many beautiful places. The mountains of North Carolina are always fantastic. I go to a lot of places. The Swanee River, the Palestine Lake is one of my favorite places. Recently I would go in the morning and do these. I call them dystopian walks, and I would walk around the neighborhood in Springfield and walk up to the kind of margins of and the tributaries of the St. Johns River, and I would look in these kind of forgotten ditches and forgotten places. And I think my favorite thing is to find the energy of these plants that want to resettle, they want to succeed, and that inspires me. It's kind of beauty that I don't have to own, and that to me has been significantly inspiring. Um, the best resources to learn about native wildflowers in our area. There's several on Facebook. I follow them. I can't think of them right now, but that's probably there's some good sources there. One of the people who I follow a lot is a guy named Doug Tallamy. I don't have his books handy, but there's Doug Tallamy did a really great book called Bringing Nature Home, which is about planting planting with native plants. Um, the native plants, it's kind of a lifetime. I've kind of made it a lifetime of learning it. So send me an email and I'll send you some more links. It's probably the best thing I can say. It's a very fascinating and complex thing. I'm looking at more questions. Jim, your panel is. Oh, okay. This is about the Baptist Hospital installation. I don't have any slides of that handy. If anybody's seen that, it's these curved panels that are at, they connect the pavilion with the Heart Hospital at Baptist and the downtown campus. The reason I curved the panels was for a couple of reasons. One was, so when I went there, they asked me to do something in that corridor, and it was a long corridor. When you walked it, at the time, I was probably more interested in the idea of feng shui or spaces, kind of making spaces feel more natural. But when you walked it, it was like walking down a saw blade because you kept getting met by these angles. That's all so I thought, well, this corridor is going to be a place where people who are in a very bad situation, they're there because a loved one is in the hospital and they've been there for weeks, and they have somebody in the who they can leave the room for a little bit, but they can't leave the hospital. So I think the corridor was a total of 300 feet. So I thought, well, when I spend a lot of time walking in the woods and walking on nature trails, I thought, well, what if I kind of treated the peripheral vision so that the space came and went the way it does. It opens and closes as the way it does when you're on a walk in the woods. That was my original idea, was to curve it and soften the edges. And then I also wanted to use the idea of ribbon or thread that connected things. So I called it the ribbon of life. And then the actual painting travels from the beach to the margins of the St. Johns River or reverse, depends on which way you're walking it. The wild columbine is in North Carolina. It'll grow. I know that it's native. It's not so much of it around here. We're probably a little bit sandy. I think you could probably find it in this outside of Tallahassee and up into the Carolinas, I know. Um, as an artist, do you ever find yourself seeing the connections between the environmental humanities and STEM? Well, uh, don't get me started. Uh, the whole, I think to solve the problems that we have in the world, which is the big, I think education is the largest problem we have in the world right now, especially in our country. But I think this idea of forsaking the humanities and trying to teach mathematics and science in a vacuum is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard of. I mean, you look at that's one thing that the study of humanities, you actually learn more about how to learn about science by studying the humanities than you do just in studying the pure mathematics and pure science. I think that I think it's just absolutely absurd the idea of not understanding. I think if everybody started the day in school with a drawing class where they would go sit outside and actually look at something and learn how to draw it, they would learn how to see. And I think that that's what we don't know how to do anymore is see. We don't know how to look. We don't know how to walk down a sidewalk and see that these plants are just crying for life so much they're pushing up through the concrete. So my high horse. How can radical naturalism impact environmental health degradation? By seeing, by looking, by observing. I mean, you observe the way nature works. I think had we been open to the way nature worked in the beginning of this COVID crisis, I think we would have had a lot of better understanding, not only of the nature of the virus, but also the nature of ourselves and the nature of our population. And we would have had a better opportunity to understand our nature as a perhaps evolved primate, that we would understand a little bit about how to act in this pandemic. Thank you. Everybody got my high horse at the end, but thank you for listening to me, and thank you. I hope you got a little something out of it. Thank you for, please go see this exhibition. It's wonderful.